In 1970s England, a family in Enfield, London, would experience a series of unexplained events that would last a terrifying 18 months. There would be more reports of paranormal events here than in any other haunting in history. What started as a series of unexplained knocks would escalate to furniture being moved, objects being thrown across the room, and one of the children becoming possessed. This is the true story behind the Conjuring 2. It all started on the night of the 31st of August 1977, when single mother Peggy Hodgson was awoken by the sound of knocking in her rented home at 284 Green Street in Enfield, London. The first thought her sleep-filled head could summon was who was knocking at the door at this time of night. Perhaps it was a neighbour in need of help, or even the police. So she got dressed and walked groggily to the door of her bedroom. But as she reached out to the door handle, her sleepiness was replaced by a growing sense of apprehension when she noticed something strange about the knocking. It was coming from inside the house. She paused, her arm still outstretched, as the first seeds of fear took root in her chest. The knocking stopped, but as she continued to listen, a loud crash filled the house, followed by the terrified screams of her two daughters, Janet, aged 11, and Margaret, aged 13. She flung open the door and raced to her bedroom, and found her two frightened daughters clinging onto each other, cowering in the corner of the room. Before she had a chance to ask, her daughters, eyes wide with fear, hurriedly told her that they'd been hearing knocks on the walls, and that the chest of drawers had been moving towards the bedroom door. Peggy looked at the chest of drawers, which had clearly been moved, and back to her daughters incredulously. There was no way her two daughters could have moved the heavy piece of oak furniture on their own. Suddenly, the drawer started to move on its own, as if pushed by some unseen force towards the bedroom door. It was then Peggy realised that whatever was pushing the drawers was trying to trap them in the room. She tried pushing back against the drawer, but it wouldn't budge. It was then she and her daughters ran out of the house and to their neighbours, Vic and Peggy Nottingham, to ask for help. This wasn't the first time her children had reported strange events in the house. Her son had reported his bed moving on its own as he lay in it the night before. It was the sound of desperate knocking and panicked cries that first alerted Peggy Nottingham to the presence of someone at their front door. She peered out through a window tentatively and was surprised to see her good friend and neighbour, Peggy Hodgson, and her two daughters in their dressing gowns banging on her front door. The three of them looked visibly distressed and afraid, and Peggy Nottingham rushed to the front door to let them in. At first, she thought there had been some sort of accident, but what the Hodgson family told them would defy belief. Vic and Peggy Nottingham had known the family for years, and knew they weren't the type of people who would make up a story of strange knocks and furniture moving on its own. But Vic was convinced there must be a rational explanation. Vic was a burly builder, not given to flights or fancy. He theorised that pranksters must have gotten into the house and were somehow responsible for the events the Hodgson family were experiencing. He went to the house to investigate, confident of catching the pranksters, but minutes later he returned, the colour completely drained from his face and clearly shaken up. Once he calmed down, he told them that when he first entered the house, he didn't hear anything. But as he walked through, he started hearing a knocking on the walls, in the bedrooms and the ceilings. He went from room to room, following the knocking and banging. But when he heard the sound of beds moving, his curiosity and bemusement transformed into fear. He knew then that this was something inexplicable. Finally, the police were called. It was hoped that if pranksters were responsible, they would be caught, or at least scared away, by the police presence. Peggy Hodgson breathed a sigh of relief when she saw the police car making its way down the street and pull up outside her house. She quickly led the officers into the house while telling them about the strange knocks and moving furniture. She didn't need to look at the two officers to sense their cynicism, but moments after entering, the officers would be forced to suspend their disbelief when they too heard the sound of knocking in the house. And the knocking was just the start. While one officer inspected each room to investigate the strange knocks and bangs, another officer watched in disbelief as a chair wobbled and finally moved 4 feet across the floor. The officer rushed over to the chair to inspect it for wires or anything that could account for its movement, and found nothing. Somehow, a solid wooden chair had slid 4 feet across the floor without anybody being near it. The constable who saw the chair move would later sign an affidavit to attest what they saw. The officers would ultimately find nothing and no one to account for the strange noises, and while mystified, they weren't able to help, as no laws had been broken, and advised the family that this was not a police matter. Graham Morris, a photographer for the Daily Mirror, was working the night shift when the call came into the newsroom. It was the neighbours of Peggy Hodgson. The next door neighbour to the family called and said, "Can you help us? We don't know what to do about it. Spooky things are happening next door. The family are beside themselves. Can you help?" Just half an hour after the police left, Graham Morris, along with a reporter, were dispatched to investigate the incredible claims. They arrived a little after midnight and were brought into the kitchen. At first, everything was calm, but as they prepared to leave, that all changed. Suddenly, objects started flying about the room. Graham Morris looked over to Penny Hodgson and her children to see if they were responsible, but they were screaming and crying in fear. That was when a Lego brick flew across the room and struck him above the eyebrow with such force that it left a bruise that remained days after. This was just the first of many occurrences Graham Morris would experience and photograph during his 18-month association with the Enfield Haunting. When he was later asked about what he experienced that night, he said, "I was looking out for it. There was no way any of them were doing it. I was watching everybody through my camera, and no one was doing that. They just couldn't have flicked it with the force that propelled it across the room. It definitely wasn't them. Following the reports of the events in the Daily Mirror, the Society for Psychical Research were contacted for advice, and Maurice Grosse was sent to investigate. Within days of his investigation, he would experience the first of 2,000 reported incidents of supernatural events in the house. It had just passed 1 a.m. on the 8th of September, when he, along with reporters for the Daily Mirror, heard a loud crash coming from the girls' room. They rushed in to find the 2 girls asleep, but a chair had been flipped over and moved a meter across the room. By late September, the events had gotten so much that the Hodgson family looked for refuge by staying with Peggy Hodgson's brother, in the hope of escaping the strange events that were tormenting the family. But shortly after the Hodgson family arrived, the strange occurrences started, beginning with a small toy levitating and then dropping onto the kitchen counter while the wife of the brother was making a cup of tea. It was clear that being away from the house would provide the family no respite. Whatever was haunting the family was able to follow them wherever they went. But as time went by, there would be one particular member of the family around whom the presence would primarily focus its attention. When the family returned home, the events had already started to escalate and seemed to now revolve around Peggy's 11-year-old daughter, Janet. On Saturday, the 26th of November, Janet's uncle, now all too familiar with the haunting, was staying with the family. The night was unusually quiet, and he started to get the feeling something was wrong. He found himself overcome with an urgent need to check on Janet. The urge grew and grew, until he finally walked into the girl's bedroom to check on his nieces to put his mind at ease. Janet's sister Margaret was asleep in bed, but Janet was nowhere to be found. This was of particular concern, as Janet had experienced a violent seizure earlier that evening and was out cold after being given 10 milligrams of Valium by the doctor. There was no way she could have left her bed, let alone the room, on her own. His first thought was that Janet had been abducted, but the bedroom window was locked tight. He looked under the bed, and she wasn't there. He walked further into the bedroom to get a complete view of the room, then froze in disbelief at what he saw. Janet, still unconscious from the Valium the doctor had given her earlier that evening, was now on top of a radio, which was on top of a chest of drawers. It looked like she had somehow floated there. This would turn out to be a sign of things to come. Janet would frequently be found on the floor of her bedroom, sometimes with the mattress or other furniture items also thrown around the room, several meters from their original positions. One of the more disturbing events was witnessed by Maurice Grosse, who reported seeing Janet seemingly dragged from her room while still asleep, and then slid down the stairs head first. The investigators soon found themselves caught in the maelstrom of apparently psychic activity. Sofas levitated, furniture spun round and was flung across the room, and the family would be hurled out of their beds at night. One day, while a neighbour was visiting the family, they heard the sound of children's screams coming from one of the bedrooms. Maurice Grosse, along with the neighbour, rushed into the room and found one of the children white with terror and screaming that they were unable to move and that something was holding their leg. Maurice and the neighbour tried to free the child, but they were held in place, seemingly by invisible hands. It was only after a few minutes of attempting to wrestle the child free that the entity released its grip. During another incident, they overheard a crash in an upstairs bedroom and found an enormous, solid cast iron double bed on its side. Everyone present agreed that it would have been impossible for the children to even move the bed, let alone tip it on its side. Some of the events were even captured on camera, and the images are disturbing. One shows Janet being thrown across the room. In others, her face is distorted in pain. When the BBC went to the house, the crew found the metal components in their tape equipment had been twisted and the recordings erased. During overnight stays with members of the Society for Psychical Research, Graham Morris would leave his camera in the children's bedroom with a long cable that led down to the kitchen while an audio recording was taken. This meant that as soon as they heard anything from the bedroom, they would be able to capture photos without needing to be present, although they wouldn't know until the following day what had been captured. It was through this approach that the now infamous images of Janet Hodgson levitating were taken. Prior to this, family members had also claimed to have seen her levitating and floating across the room. Additionally, there were two separate witnesses outside the house who reported seeing Janet through the bedroom window, floating in the air. The first witness was a lollipop lady who worked the zebra crossing close to the Hodgsons' home. She reported seeing Janet going up and down in front of the window. At first, she thought Janet was just jumping, but as she continued to watch, she noticed that Janet was laying horizontally and clearly distressed as she was propelled up and down half a dozen times. The second witness was John Rainbow, a baker delivering bread to the school opposite. He reported seeing Janet float around the room in a clockwise direction while the curtains blew wildly. This was despite the window being closed. December would mark the start of one of the most infamous incidents of the Enfield Haunting. The entity that had been plaguing the family would finally announce itself in the most terrifying way imaginable. Maurice Grosse challenged the spirits to talk. At first, all they received in reply were a series of whistles and dog-like barks. But before long, a gruff, male voice came from Janet herself. Whatever entity was tormenting the family was now possessing Janet. The voice would identify itself as William Bill Wilkins, and when asked if it remembered what happened when he died, it said it died of a hemorrhage. Remarkably, Bill's son would later confirm that not only did his dad, Bill Wilkins, live in that house years before, but he also died of a brain hemorrhage while resting in an armchair.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died. Just before you died and just after you died.
Days before I died, I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage and I fell asleep and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs.
Janet would speak in this gravelly, menacing voice for hours at a time, and when vocal tests were carried out by a professor from Birnbeck College, it was concluded that it was next to impossible to speak at length in such a way due to the damage such speech would cause to the vocal cords. Still, people remained sceptical, so Maurice made Janet hold a quantity of water in her mouth and taped it shut. He then asked Bill to repeat phrases that are notoriously difficult for ventriloquists to say, things like bottle of beer. According to the researchers, the water and tape didn't affect the voice's clarity. Following the experiments, Maurice Grosse offered a £1,000 reward for anybody who could replicate a similar voice under similar conditions. No one, not even professional ventriloquists, took up the challenge. Other paranormal investigators who visited the Enfield house included American demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. Although their involvement was not as expansive as is shown in the film, the Warrens did study the case, and they concluded it was an authentic haunting. After 18 months, the activity gradually quietened down, and while the family still reported the occasional paranormal occurrence, it was nothing like what the family had experienced before. Despite there being significant evidence and documentation on the Enfield haunting, questions remain as to if the whole thing was an elaborate and ingenious hoax. There remains questions about Janet's gruff voice and if she was just a highly skilled ventriloquist. Some skeptics, following examination of the photos of Janet levitating, claim that these are just mid-air photos of her jumping off the beds. But the most significant piece of evidence skeptics point to when dismissing the Enfield haunting as a hoax is when Janet was videotaped bending spoons. She also openly admitted to faking some of the phenomena, although she and her sister claimed this was just to see if the investigators could tell the difference between the real and faked phenomena, and insisted that only 2% of the events in the house were actually faked. Unfortunately, Janet's admission that she had faked some of the events brings the credibility of the Enfield haunting as a whole into question. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and even with evidence, it often requires a tremendous leap of faith to convert skeptics into believers. So even if Janet had only faked 2% of the events in that house, the immediate question becomes, how do we know you didn't fake 100% of the events in that house? And the answer is, we don't. Although there still remains some very compelling evidence to suggest that something unexplained may indeed have been going on. Firstly, there is a constable's sworn affidavit that they had heard knocks and a chair was moving, seemingly on its own. Then there is the fact that Janet somehow not only knew that a Bill Wilkins previously lived in the house, but she even knew the manner of his death. And finally, there were over 30 independent witnesses that included family, reporters, researchers, professors, and the police, all of whom verified the events of the Enfield haunting. So was the Enfield haunting fact or faked? The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. There is enough evidence to suggest that something unexplained and potentially paranormal was taking place, but that as interest in the case grew, some of the claims were exaggerated or faked. Janet was 11 at the time of the investigation, and it wouldn't be unusual for a teenager to want to play the occasional trick on adults for their own amusement. But this doesn't necessarily equate to every event being faked. There is another contributing factor to the Enfield Haunting, which is that Janet's parents had just gone through a messy divorce, and the family were living in considerable poverty, and Janet was approaching puberty. It has been theorised that poltergeist activity, rather than being spiritual, is a physical manifestation of an adolescent's emotional turbulence as they grapple with the changes that their bodies are going through, and when combined with emotional distress, such as a parent's divorce, this can result in a destructive telekinesis that the adolescent isn't in control of or even aware they are doing. If this is the case, then Janet fits the profile perfectly. Janet and her sister would also admit to playing with a Ouija board shortly before the activity in the house started. They even claimed to have seen the face of a demon appear in their garden shed's window. But until more evidence is uncovered, the strange events that took place during the Enfield Haunting are likely to remain unexplained. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, share and subscribe. It makes such a difference to small channels like these, and that way you won't miss any of our weekly uploads. And if you made it this far, thank you very much for listening.